Have you ever tried to apply a proven, guaranteed best practice to a massive business problem only to watch it spectacularly fail? Well, you're definitely not alone. For decades, leaders have been sold this myth of the one-size-fits-all management theory. But what if the reason your strategies are failing isn't actually your execution? What if you're just using the exact right tool for the completely wrong type of problem? Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to absolutely shatter that myth by exploring the Cynefin Framework. It's an incredibly powerful tool that will permanently change how you assess and navigate your everyday business environment.
Okay, let's dive into this. The very first thing we need to do is fundamentally shift how we look at data. You know when a consultant hands you a standard 2x2 matrix? What they're really handing you is a categorization model. In those models, the framework already exists. You just take your data and drop it into a pre-existing box. And sure, that's fast, but it completely misses all the subtle differences until it's way, way too late. Cynefin, on the other hand, is a sense-making framework, and that distinction matters. Here, the data must precede the framework. The patterns actually emerge from the data itself. You're not forcing reality into a box. You're letting reality show you its true shape. Now, before we go any further, let's quickly address that unusual name on the screen. It's spelled Cynefin, but you actually pronounce it Cynefin. It's a Welsh word. It roughly translates to habitat, but the deeper meaning is the place of your multiple belongings. It basically describes that sensation of being rooted in many different histories and paths that profoundly influence who you are, but, things you can only ever be partially aware of. And honestly, that is exactly why it's the perfect name for a complexity framework. Just like us, a complex business system has thousands of hidden influences shaping it that we can never, ever fully map out.
All right, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, sense-making over categorization. Second, the danger of disorder. Third, navigating the ordered domains. Fourth, embracing the complex domain. Fifth, chaos and the complacency cliff. And finally, applying the Cynefin Framework. Understanding this exact map is going to profoundly change how you assess your business. Let's get going.
Section 1. Sense-making over categorization. Let's get right to it.
This is the foundational mindset shift you've got to make before we even look at the map itself. We need to understand why our traditional, rigid models fail us so badly when things change rapidly. Check out this quote. A model seeks to represent reality. A framework is a way of looking at reality. Cynefin doesn't just hand you the answers. Instead, it gives you an entirely new lens through which to view your problems. It lets you figure out what kind of world you're currently standing in so you can actually decide how to act.
Section 2, the danger of disorder. Let's look at the center of the map.
So the Cynefin map features 5 separate domains, but we're actually going to start dead in the center. Why? Because honestly, this is where most leaders actually operate from on a daily basis, and they usually don't even realize it. It's called disorder. Now, disorder isn't chaos. It simply means you're in a state of not knowing which of the other systems you're currently in. And when we don't know what kind of problem we're facing, well, human nature takes over, right? We assess situations based entirely on our own personal history and our preference for action rather than reality. For example, if you're a bureaucrat, you'll look at a crisis and say, this is a failure of process. We need a new rule. If you're an expert, you'll probably say, I just didn't have enough time to run the analytics. Politicians, they'll naturally try to gather a diverse committee to talk about it. And authoritarian leaders will use the crisis as an excuse to seize absolute control. None of them are responding to reality. They're just retreating to what makes them feel comfortable. So take a second and really ask yourself this critical question. When a crisis hits your desk, are you actually managing the situation as it exists in reality, or are you simply reacting with your own personal preference for action? Escaping disorder means putting those biases aside before we explore the 4 actionable domains.
Section 3, navigating the ordered domains. Time to look at the right side of the map. Let's explore those actionable domains now. The right side of the Cynefin framework is the world of order. In these domains, there's a clear, linear relationship between cause and effect. Basically, the same thing will happen the same way twice. Order is divided into 2 distinct domains, simple, which is sometimes called obvious, and complicated. I want you to notice the practice types listed here. In the simple domain, we use best practice, but in the complicated domain, we use good practice. Understanding why these are different is hands down one of the most vital takeaways for any manager. Let's break them down.
In the simple or obvious domain, the rules are self-evident to literally any reasonable person. Nobody disputes it. Think about driving, for instance. In the UK, you drive on the left. In the US, you drive on the right. There's no debate. So the decision model here is super efficient. You sense what country you're in, you categorize it, and you respond by driving on the correct side of the road. Standard operating procedures and rigid rules thrive here. Actually, this is the only domain where the term best practice is genuinely legitimate. There really is just one right way to do it. So the crucial point is how this differs from the complicated domain. In the complicated domain, there's still a linear relationship between cause and effect, sure, but it is not self-evident. You can't just figure it out by looking at it. You have to deploy an analytical method or bring in an actual expert. The decision model here shifts to sense, analyze, respond. And because experts are required, there are often several different, perfectly legitimate ways to solve the problem. Think of experienced doctors diagnosing a patient with multiple overlapping illnesses or multimorbidity. One doctor might take a slightly different approach than another, but both are valid, right? This is exactly why we rely on good practice here, not best practice. Forcing a rigid, singular best practice onto experts in a complicated environment, it doesn't help. It actually destroys trust and breeds resentment.
Section 4. Embracing the complex domain. This is where things get really interesting.
Now, what happens when that linear relationship between cause and effect just breaks down entirely? Well, you enter the left side of the framework, the complex domain. And frankly, this is where most modern business takes place. In the order domains we just talked about, you can rely on fail-safe designs. You can trust experts to analyze the data and find the right answer. But in complexity, everything changes. There is no linear causality. You don't know the right answer until after you take action. Here, experts can't give you facts. They can only give you hypotheses. If you ask an expert to guarantee a result in a complex system, their hypothesis will likely fail. Instead, your decision model has to shift to probe, sense, respond. You must run small, safe-to-fail experiments. If an experiment works, you amplify it. If it starts failing, you dampen it. You aren't forcing a result anymore. You're allowing a new, emergent practice to reveal itself. To manage those safe-to-fail experiments effectively, leaders have to understand the concept of enabling constraints. In ordered systems, we use rigid governing constraints. Think of it like a solid fence around a yard. But in complexity, we use enabling constraints. These are rules of thumb or heuristics. They guide behavior without dictating the exact outcome. They allow your team to self-organize, adapt, and, crucially, make the inevitable mistakes required to learn what actually works in a complex world.
To show you just how powerful this is, let's look at military history. Before Napoleon Bonaparte, battlefield commanders generally just waited around for specific orders from a general sitting on a hill. But combat is the ultimate complex environment. Waiting for rigid orders will literally get you killed. So Napoleon instituted a brilliant enabling constraint. His heuristic was super simple: march to the sound of the guns. It was a guiding principle. Everyone knew everyone else was following it. It didn't tell a commander exactly how to fight, but it enabled massive, rapid, self-organizing capability across the entire army. And this brilliantly illustrates how modern forces operate today. Take the U.S. Marines. Operating in highly complex, unpredictable combat environments, they use 3 primary enabling constraints: capture the high ground, stay in touch, keep moving. That's it. As long as Marines follow those heuristics, they're allowed to experiment, adapt to the enemy, and figure out the tactics on the fly. This is how you manage complexity, folks. Not with micromanagement, but with enabling constraints.
Section 5. Chaos and the complacency cliff.
But what happens when there are 0 constraints and absolutely no patterns? That brings us to the chaotic domain. Now, if you enter chaos deliberately, it's usually a highly controlled environment designed for radical innovation. But if you fall into chaos accidentally, it is an absolute nightmare. Your house is on fire, you don't have time to probe or run analytics, and you certainly don't have time to run a safe-to-fail experiment. The decision model here is act, sense, respond. Your first and only priority is to act immediately and forcefully to build a container and stabilize the situation. And any practice you use here is going to be completely novel because the old rules just don't exist anymore.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the Cynefin map visually handles boundaries. Most of the borders between these domains are pretty fluid, right? You can transition back and forth smoothly. But the boundary between the simple domain and the chaotic domain is completely different. It's depicted as a cliff. It is not a gradual transition at all. It is a catastrophic sudden drop.
This boundary is known as the zone of complacency. If you over-constrain a system, like if you treat every single problem as if it's simple, or if you mandate rigid best practices for every scenario, or if you just start believing that your past success guarantees your future safety, you are pushing your organization right to the edge of this cliff. And when a crisis finally hits, those rigid rules just snap. You don't slide gracefully in for complexity, you fall directly over the edge into total chaos. And as the source material warns,
Climbing back up from that crisis is incredibly painful and very, very expensive.
Section 6. Applying the Cynefin Framework. Let's talk about what to do tomorrow morning. So, how do we actually implement this sense-making framework so we never fall off that cliff? Let's turn this map into practical leadership. The secret to Cynefin is requisite applicability. That's basically just a fancy way of saying change your leadership style based on the domain you're standing in. Stop imposing rigid best practices onto experts solving complicated and complex problems. Give them the freedom to use good practice. When you're dealing with the unknown in the complex domain, stop asking for guarantees and start running safe-to-fail experiments, guided by enabling constraints. To really protect your organization, you should spend the vast majority of your time managing in the complicated and complex spaces. Move only the highly stable, unquestionable processes into the simple domain, and keep a very close eye on them so you don't wander blindly toward that complacency cliff.
We've covered a ton of ground today, but I want to leave you with this final provocative question. The next time a massive challenge lands on your desk, I want you to pause. Don't just let your personal preference for action dictate your response. Step back and ask yourself, which domain is my organization actually operating from today? And more importantly, are you using the right tools to survive it? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep making sense of the world, and I'll see you next time.